Welcome to the Workers' Reading Room. Today I'll be reading Chapter 2 of F.I.S.T. by Joe Eszterhas. But first, a quick recap. In the previous chapter, we were briefly introduced to Joe Kovac, Hungarian immigrant, steel worker, and father of the main character Johnny Kovac, as well as foster father to Abe Belkin. Joe Kovac dies on the job early on, and during the funeral we are introduced to his hot-headed son Johnny. Johnny reflects on memories of the good man his father was while struggling with the anger he holds for the company who killed Joe Kovac. I would like to add that if you've seen the movie and not read the book, none of this context is in the movie itself. The chapter ends with Joe Kovac's funeral procession leaving the church. And now, Chapter 2 of F.I.S.T. Al Dorset stood in the soup line and watched the hearse. His guts were on fire. His feet felt like they had 1,000 jagged splinters in them. The hearse creaked its way down the bumpy, potholed street. At least that guy's got a ride, Al Dorset thought. Come my turn, they'll pick me off the cement, toss me into a trunk, and shovel me into a field. He had been out on the street since 6 o'clock this morning. He had gone from fence to fence, from plant to plant. This morning, when he kissed Julie goodbye, he had found a smile in himself somewhere and said, "Maybe this is our lucky day." Julie had smiled back, "Maybe it is." And now Al Dorset stood in the soup line on his lucky day, waiting for his lunch, a cipher in a line of ciphers waiting for warm, greasy water. The soup line stretched to the end of the block. Still more men joined it, and it spilled into the street. In a few minutes, Al Dorset knew, the street would be blocked. The cops would come. He hoped he'd have his soup by then. When the street got blocked, the cops got angry and shut the soup truck down. "What have we got for dessert today?" someone shouted behind him. No one laughed. Ahead of him, a man was talking to a friend. "What we all ought to do, we all ought to go down to a grocery store. We all ought to walk into the place and take whatever we want. All of us." The man waved his hands excitedly as he spoke. A mirthless laugh. "You dumb shit," his friend said. "They'd shoot you dead." Nah, they wouldn't. Not if we all goes down there in a big-ass group. They ain't gonna shoot all of us. Hell, they wouldn't even call the cops. I'm telling you they wouldn't." "Hell, they wouldn't," his friend said. "You're dreaming now. The hell they wouldn't." "I'm telling you. They'd be afraid to, see? They wouldn't want it to get out what we done. If it got out what we done, that we all gone down there and took whatever we wanted, hell, everybody'd do it. They'd have to close up all the stores. They'd have to." A pause. "It'd start a revolution." "Revolution, my ass," his friend growled. "We would. We'd start a revolution. All I want's some soup," his friend said. "If I don't find work soon," Al Dorset thought, listening to them, "the landlord will throw us out. If I don't find work soon, I'm going to have to take Julie and the kids and move into the Hooverville by the lake and fight off the rats." The rats were getting fatter each day. It was always like that. When people went hungry, the rats got fat. The sweat poured off his forehead into Al Dorset's eyes, and for a moment everything blurred in front of him. "I want to go to California," he heard a young man say. "I got me a pal that went out there. He's in the gravy now. You can live for about nothing out there off the ocean. All you gotta do is, you gotta go out each day and catch the fish. Besides of which, they got palm trees, and it's warm all the time." "Palm trees?" somebody said. "Can you eat one of them palm trees?" "Warm," somebody else said. "He wants it warm. It ain't warm enough for him right here." "Sure you can eat 'em," somebody said. "Ain't you ever heard of palm tree stew?" Al Dorset laughed. He had begun this day at the West Side Market, shopping at the market dump. There was always a crowd when he got there. When the trucks dumped their loads of garbage, men, women, and children attacked the new mounds, poking around in it with their hands. Maybe it was the smell this morning, or the heat. Maybe he was losing his grip. But all he could do today was watch them. He couldn't force himself to dig in. He felt as if he were outside of himself, watching himself standing there, paralyzed. They dug into the rotted piles and picked out tomatoes, lettuce, squash, bits of meat. They were excited and joyful, and Al Dorset cursed the God that had put him on this earth. Then he had gone to Arnold's Bakery on West 28th Street and had stood in line for the 2-day-old bread. He stood in line for 2.5 hours. When there were only 4 people in front of him, the fat woman closed her window and said, "We've got plenty inside, nice and hot, just out of the oven." Now here he was, in a soup line again, shuffling toward the back of the truck. He took his shirt off and toweled his face with it. He rolled the shirt up and stuck it into his pants, which were a size too big for him. "Fucking Jesus," somebody said. "Look at that thing." A black car came down the street towards them. Al Dorset loved cars and looked at this one closely. A 1932 Packard, the new ports on its hood, its interior gleaming black leather. 3 men in it. The 2 in the front were young, wise-looking guys who smirked out at them. An older man sat in the back reading a newspaper with gold spectacles. All 3 wore suits and ties. The man with the gold spectacles wore a straw hat. On the side of the car were the words Baldwin and Johnson Steel Co. The letters were painted in gold. Al Dorset watched the Packard and thought how good it would feel to drive a car like that, to grasp that steering wheel, his head high, and coast down a country road, to press himself on a day as hot as this against that cool black leather. He watched the car go to the end of the block and then stop. The soup line had snaked completely across the street now and the car couldn't get through. He heard the car horn, heard one of the men in the line yell, "Eat shit, you rich bastards!" Some of the other men picked it up and laughed. The horn honked again. The men didn't move. It's too late, Al Dorset thought. I'll never have a car like that. He was 44 years old, a good husband, a good father. He had never done anything in his life to cause harm to another man. He had fought bravely for his country in the Argonne forest, where he'd been wounded, and now here he was, waiting for a cup of greasy water, worrying about the rats getting fatter each day. "The hell with them!" Al Dorset heard himself shout to the men blocking the car. "Don't move!" The men in the line picked it up. "Don't move! Don't move! Don't move!" It was a full-throated roar. The hell with them, with all of them, with all the rich, stinking bastards who had big bellies and owned the big houses and read newspapers with gold spectacles and blocked the sun with straw hats, with presidents and bosses who made big speeches and bigger promises filled with bullshit and hot air, with the men who had sent him to war and still wouldn't pay him the money they owed him. "The hell with them!" Al Dorset shouted to the men in the street. "Don't move!" It was just as hot then, he remembered, a day just like this one, 4 years ago. He had gone to Washington to demand what they owed him, a $500 cash bonus for the war. The whole town was filled with veterans, jobless and hungry men who set tents up for themselves in that hell-hot sun, so hot the cherry blossom trees were burned completely bare. They had called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force. Then, one afternoon, the bastards came down on them, cavalry with their shiny sabers, machine guns, the 34th Infantry, 6 tanks, their trucks eating up the concrete. That tin horn leading them all, General Douglas MacArthur, high on his white horse as a goddamn Hun. They set their machine guns up and came marching into the camp, destroying the homes they had fashioned out of fruit crates, chicken coops, gunny sacks, beached old cars. "Where were you in the air gone, buddy?" he had yelled, and then he screamed until there was nothing left in his lungs. "Yella! Yella! Yella!" They kept on coming, burning everything down. A kid had a rabbit he kept in a tent. The tent on fire, the kid tried to go back in for it. A tin horn saw the kid. He stuck his bayonet through the kid's leg. Next morning, the garbage trucks came around, bodies all over them. Down the street, the Packard honked its horn again. "Let's get 'em!" Al Dorset yelled. He ran for the car along with a dozen other men. They surrounded it. Their fists banged on its hood. The 2 wise guys in the front looked scared. The one with the gold spectacles in the back looked up from his paper and said something to them. The car moved into reverse and backed away. The men cheered. They had won. The car stood a few hundred feet from them in the middle of the street, its engine idling. More and more men crowded into the street, laughing, shaking their fists. Then, suddenly, the car came roaring at them. The driver had his eyes and his mouth wide open. The one next to him was laughing. The one with the gold spectacles wasn't even watching. He was reading the newspaper again. The car was coming straight at him, Al Dorset saw, its engine screaming, a hurtling black cannonball aimed right at his guts. He threw himself desperately to the concrete. The Packard exploded by him. He lay on the pavement, bleeding from his elbow but otherwise unhurt, and then he got up and went back to the line to wait for his soup. Behind them, in the cramped little living room, the women were asking the priest to say the rosary. "Pray, pray, pray," Mishka Biro said to Johnny and Abe. "If Joe was here, he'd say enough pray already. We go down the basement and get the wine." He was a barrel-chested little man with silver hair and a snow-white mustache. "What the hell," he said. "Joe was a good man or no? He go to hell or no? Make no difference now." "Quiet," one of the women hissed. "We will say the rosary." "Say it," Mishka said loudly. "You gonna say it? Say it. Me? I'm not gonna say it. I'm gonna go home." Johnny and Abe laughed. Mishka waved and walked out. The priest was halfway through the Our Father when the three men walked into the room. The priest stopped praying. The women watched them. The men were wearing new suits and brightly shined shoes. They looked like they didn't belong there. The room was quiet. "Excuse me," one of them said, smiling. "I'm looking for Mrs. Kovac." He had a straw hat in his hands and a pair of gold spectacles on his nose. He had very white teeth. "We didn't mean to interrupt," he said. There was a pause, and then Johnny stepped to him. "I'm Johnny Kovac." The man smiled again. "I'm Charles Holden." He stuck his hand out. "I'm the personnel manager at Baldwin Johnson." Johnny nodded and looked at his outstretched hand. The man pulled it back. "I'm sorry about your father. He was a fine man, one of our best workers. I always liked him." He smiled again. Johnny said, "Did you?" The two younger men stepped closer to Holden. "I'll get Ma," Abe said. "Good," Holden said. "Thank you." "Wait a minute," Johnny said. He looked at Holden challengingly. "What do you want to talk to her about?" "It's a business matter." "What kind of business matter?" "Really," Holden said, "can't we talk somewhere else? We're interrupting the ceremony." He looked at the priest apologetically. "She's in the kitchen," Abe said. Holden turned to the priest and the women in the living room and smiled. "I'm sorry, Father." Abe led them into the kitchen. The priest continued saying the rosary. Ilona Kovac stood at the stove making coffee. There was a battered table in the room, 4 chairs, along with the white stove and a nearly empty larder. Joe Kovac's ancient cap hung on a peg on the wall not far from a portrait of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Holden introduced himself to her. "I'm so very sorry about your husband," he said, and held her hand consolingly. Johnny leaned against the wall, not saying anything. Holden's men eyed him. "Sit, please," Ilona Kovac said. "You like coffee?" "I'd love some," Holden smiled. He sat down at the little table. "My English no good," Ilona Kovac said. "My boys, they translate." "Of course," Holden said. She turned to the two men with Holden. "You? Coffee?" "No thanks, ma'am," one of them said. "It's good coffee," Johnny said. "Go on, have some." He leaned against the wall and grinned at them. They watched him suspiciously. She served the coffee and sat down at the table across from Holden. Abe sat at the head of the table. Johnny slouched against the wall. The two men stood by the door. Holden sipped his coffee. "It really is excellent." "See what I mean?" Johnny said, grinning at the two men. "You guys should have had some." There was a pause. "Well," Holden said, "as I was telling your boy, Mrs. Kovac, your husband was one of our best workers. He was a fine man. I always liked John." Johnny laughed. "You must have known him pretty good." Holden ignored it and continued. "I'm here to express the company's condolences." "Condolence?" Ilona Kovac said to Abe. "What is that?" "Big word, Ma," Johnny grinned. Abe translated it for her. Holden said, "We are a generous company, Mrs. Kovac. We always try to take good care of our workers and their families, especially in these times. These are such difficult times for everyone." She nodded slowly. "Your husband worked for us a long time, Mrs. Kovac. Baldwin and Johnson wants to demonstrate its appreciation. I've brought you this check as an expression of our sympathy." "Get the fuck out of here," Johnny said sharply, his voice very low. Abe turned on him. "Hey," he said, "come on, Ma's here." Holden held the check up in the air. Ilona Kovac looked at it, then reached for it slowly. "You understand, Mrs. Kovac," Holden said. "We don't have to do this. Your husband died of natural causes. We are in no way responsible." Johnny laughed bitterly. "Did you hear that, Ma?" Holden pressed it. "Do you understand that, Mrs. Kovac?" "Yes," she said, her face blank. "I understand." "Good," Holden smiled. "We understand each other then." He pushed his chair back. "How much, Ma?" Johnny said. "We'd better be going," Holden said. Ilona Kovac nodded. "Ma, how much?" $100, she said. She didn't look at him. $100? Johnny said quietly. He stepped to Holden. $100 lousy dollars? He shouted. He turned to his mother. "They killed him, Ma. You know that." "Hold on, bub," one of Holden's men said. "Give it back to him, Ma." He stood over her, staring at her. She avoided his gaze and kept her eyes on the check. "Ma, give it back to him." She stared at the check and didn't say anything. "Goodbye, madam," Holden said. "Good luck to you." One of his men looked at Johnny and smiled. "Thanks for the coffee," he said. They walked out of the room. "Goodbye," Ilona Kovac said. Her voice was a hollow whisper. She kept staring at the check. "Jesus Christ, Ma!" Johnny turned sharply away from her. In the momentary silence, he could hear the cadence of the rosary coming from the living room. "Johnny," Ilona Kovac said softly, "we gotta eat." "I'll get a job, Ma. I'll get some money." She nodded and didn't say anything. "Ma, I promise you." They looked at each other a moment. "Johnny, Johnny," she said. She got up and walked out into the living room. Johnny went to the window and watched the big black Packard with the gold letters on its side. Holden was reading a newspaper. The two men in the front seat were laughing. He turned from the window in fury. He didn't even know his fucking name. Abe stared at the table's scarred surface. "Let it alone, Johnny." "Sure," Johnny said. "Let it alone. He wasn't your old man." When Abe Belkin was 12 years old, a slight, fair-haired boy who liked to stand by the river and watch the ore boats go by, his father died. Ivan Belkin had raised the boy alone from the age of 4, and when he was crushed to death by a motor at the Olson Tool Company, the boy locked himself in the house for 5 days and lay on his bed staring at the peeling plaster ceiling. On the evening of the 5th day, there was a knock at the door. The knock turned to louder and louder banging, and the next thing the boy knew, the door came crashing down and Joe Kovac, who had been Ivan Belkin's best friend, stood there swearing at him. Joe Kovac took him home. Ilona Kovac fed him hot bean soup with kolbats in it and put him to bed. The next morning, Joe Kovac woke him at 6 o'clock and told him to get his skinny, lazy ass out of bed. No son of Ivan Belkin's was going to sleep the day away. Joe Kovac fed him, paid for the clothes on his back, hugged him before he fell asleep each night. And almost before he knew it, Abe Belkin had the family he'd only read about in his books. He barely remembered his mother, knew her only from the things Ivan Belkin had told him. His mother, Ivan Belkin had said, had the gentlest heart in the world. She liked books, fine music, and walks in the spring rain. And he had had no business, Ivan Belkin said, bringing her to America. She was not built to endure the hardships of an immigrant's life. She was afraid of the raucous and often hostile country and cowered from it inside her books and music. And until the day he died, Ivan Belkin blamed himself for his wife's death. She died of appendicitis. The doctor who spoke Slovak and Hungarian was away for the weekend, and Rose Belkin didn't want an American doctor to see her naked. So she hid her pain and waited for the old country doctor, and by the time he got back, she was dead. Ivan Belkin had always been a man of wildly shifting moods, but after her death he sank into an overwhelming depression. He reached for his bottle more often, spoke little to his son, who reminded him of his dead wife, and spent most of his time at the plant or at Ziggy's tavern. Abe was a shy boy who didn't like arguments, yet he was stubborn and unyielding when he felt he was right, but always in a rational, soft-spoken way. He didn't like fights and he didn't do well in them, not only because he was small, but also because he never seemed to be able to get his heart into a fight. Fighting proved nothing. He preferred his brains to his fists. Joe Kovac understood these things, encouraged his reading, bragged to his friends about Abe's grades in school, and used him as an example whenever Johnny came home with a bloody nose. In the beginning, in the first few years after Abe moved in with the Kovacs, Johnny would pick at him. He'd challenge him, call him names, make fun of his reading. But as the years went by, as they spent more time with each other, as Ilona Kovac kept telling them to help your brother, they made an unstated pact with each other. Abe was 2 years younger than Johnny, yet he had a skill with numbers and words that far surpassed his age. Johnny had the same precocious skill with his fists and with the harsh, crude word that could hack someone off. So they took care of each other in their differing ways, almost becoming brothers even though they remained almost total opposites. Johnny was big, Abe was small. Johnny always had a girl, Abe always had a book. Johnny was trigger-tempered, Abe was always patient. Johnny couldn't hold a job, and Abe, like Joe Kovac and Ivan Belkin, was a good worker. Not that he cared for his job at the Fleckner Brothers warehouse. He was abused and underpaid, and each day he had to face the foreman he despised. But the job supported him, and 2 years ago, when he was 18, he had moved out of Joe Kovac's house and taken out a single room on Front Street to prove to himself that he was a man, that he could support himself. And while he hated his job, his reading taught him that workers were abused and underpaid everywhere. Fleckner Brothers was just a symptom of a worldwide disease called capitalism. Capitalism robbed the worker of his dignity and self-respect, and since it was the same everywhere, in every warehouse and mill, it did no good to lash out at individual places and bosses the way Johnny always did. They would just fire you and you'd be out on the street again, begging for another job where the same thing would happen. But while he knew that the game was rigged, that the system itself was at fault, Abe didn't know what to do about it. He liked much of what Communist Party organizers said, but he couldn't bring himself to approve of their solutions. Revolutions meant bloodshed and violence, and while he believed that the injustices had to be wiped out, Abe Belkin didn't believe in bloodshed and violence. It was a position which paralyzed him. So he continued his reading, seeking illumination and insight, and went to work in the dingy Fleckner Brothers warehouse each day, being a good worker, earning his wage. He tried to talk to Johnny about these things sometimes and got nowhere. "I don't give a shit about all that stuff," Johnny would say. "All I care about's me." "It's all tied in, don't you see? I'm talking about you." "What's a bunch of big words got to do with me? I just don't like getting fucked over, that's all. All I know is they can't fuck me over." "They can kick your ass out, can't they?" "Not before I get a couple punches in," Johnny would grin. That had always been Johnny's solution to everything. When he was 14 and Johnny 16, he and Johnny were walking around Public Square late one winter afternoon. Snow was piled high on the ground and it was so cold Abe could feel his hair frozen in clumps. It was just before Christmas. The Swearingen Company had its mammoth tree lighted up on the square. They were standing in front of it, staring at it. "Look at the flatheads," somebody said. There were 6 of them. They were in their late teens. They wore fur coats and fur caps and gloves, scarves that dangled all the way down to their shiny, expensive boots. "What are you looking at, flathead?" one of them said to Johnny. He looked about 18. He was bigger than Johnny and had a bright red scarf. "Haven't you ever seen a Christmas tree before? Don't they have them where you come from?" The others laughed. It was getting dark and they were badly outnumbered. Abe glanced around the square. He desperately wanted to see someone who would break this up. No luck. Their side of the square was empty. "Don't you have a mouth?" the red scarf said to Johnny. Can't you speak the language? The others laughed again. I got a mouth, Johnny said, but you're gonna need a new one. Oh ho ho, one of them laughed. Listen to the flathead. I know you've got one, the red scarf said, his eyes locked on Johnny's. You use it to go to the toilet every day. Johnny swung. Look out, Abe screamed. The ice ball exploded against Johnny's right eye, and in a second all 6 of them converged on the 2 of them, flailing and kicking. They hit the ground. 3 of them were on top of Johnny, Abe saw, smashing away at his nose and mouth, and then Abe felt a boot go deep into the back of his skull and the Christmas tree lights swirled, tilted upside down, turned black. Get up! Johnny was screaming at him. Get up! Johnny was bleeding from his nose and mouth, holding his right eye. Abe got up, dazed and numb, and saw the 6 of them running down Lucid Avenue, hooting and laughing. Johnny was running after them, still holding his eye. Abe ran behind him, trying to stay on his feet. They were splitting up now. 3 of them ran toward Prospect Avenue, and at 4th Street, 2 of the others headed for Superior. The red scarf kept running down Lucid. He was a block ahead of them. Come on, Johnny yelled back to Abe. We can't get them. The fuck we can't. They ran past 9th Street, dodging heavy traffic, past the policeman standing inside his booth directing cars, past Playhouse Square, through a ticket line in front of the Palace Theater box office, past a woman in the line who said, oh my God, when Johnny ran by her. A block past Playhouse Square, they stopped to catch their breaths. A block ahead of them, the one with the red scarf had stopped too, and was spread-eagled against a doorway, gasping. Johnny's right eye was a purple grapefruit. Much of his face was dark brown. The freezing cold had clotted the blood there. They started running again down a Lucid Avenue, gaining on the red scarf now, in the section known as Millionaire's Row, where the houses had gables and white pillars, where the driveways seemed a mile long. The red scarf tripped and got up again, and just as he turned into a driveway, Johnny caught him. Help me! The red scarf screamed. Johnny knocked him to the ground. He was beating at the kid's eyes, landing one punch after another, always to his eyes. The kid was sobbing. Abe heard a woman scream inside the house, and then the front door of the big white house opened, and a man was running toward them down the long driveway. He's got a gun, Johnny! Johnny jumped up and they ran into the street. Behind them they heard a shot and then another. In an alley between Lucid and Chester, they threw themselves down behind a row of garbage cans. They lay there panting, not saying anything. They heard sirens. A police car came down the alley with a spotlight and passed them. They crouched in the alley for several hours, half frozen now, and then ducked down a network of back alleys which led them down to the flats. When Alona Kovacs saw them, she made the sign of the cross and ran into the bedroom to wake her husband up. When Joe Kovacs saw the purple grapefruit that was Johnny's eye, he yelled, Jesus Christ, what happened? What the hell happened? He couldn't stop yelling it. What the hell happened? Johnny told him and he yelled, You stupid! You could have got killed! It wasn't that bad, Pa, Johnny said. Shut your mouth, Joe Kovac yelled. You, Abe? Where's your big brains? I'm sorry, Pa. Yeah, Joe Kovac said. You sorry? You both gonna be sorry. Down the basement. They got down to the basement and Joe Kovac lined them up under the bare bulb in the middle of the room. Now I tell you, no, Johnny, no more trouble. What the hell was I supposed to do? Johnny said. Let him go? You do what I tell you, Joe Kovac said. No more trouble. Okay, Pa, Abe said. Johnny, Kovac said, you hear me? Johnny looked away from him. I hear you, he mumbled. Joe Kovac nodded, looked at them, and walked away to his cabinet. He reached up, pulled down a bottle of wine he had made, a bottle of his best, and said, Drink. Drink all. Warm you up. The day after Joe Kovac's burial, Abe Belkin walked toward the Fleckner Brothers warehouse and remembered that bottle of wine. It was the best bottle of wine that he had ever had. That is the end of Chapter 2 of F.I.S.T. Thank you all for listening to the Workers' Reading Room. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good one, folks.